Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do my May wrap up. I normally prefer to do these in vlog style as I go throughout the month. I haven't done that in May, partly because of time, but also I haven't read all that many books, but what I have read has been really good, apart from a few DNFs, which we will start with. The first is Falling Sideways by Thomas E. Kennedy. I was reading this for my library book club. I didn't get very far into it. It's set in a workplace in Copenhagen. This sort of, I don't even know what type of workplace it is, business, financy place. And it's meant to be a satire, it's meant to be quite funny about these business people. The reason I DNF'd it was because the descriptions of the women characters always had to contain a description of their breasts and their cup size, which I thought was quite unnecessary. So that was a shame. We are struggling in the book club to find any books that any of us are interested in reading. Slight tangent, but I thought I'd show you this. So, because it's a library book club, we choose from the sets of books that the library has reading group sets of. And this is the list of the books that they have reading group sets of, and it looks like quite a long list. But bear in mind, the group has been meeting for over 15 years. I've been a member for 9 years, and we've read most of these books. And the library does add a handful of books every year, but it's still a struggle every month to be able to pick something that even one of us might be remotely interested in reading. So anyway, that was another disappointing book club read. And then I have two more DNFs. Both of these DNFs are probably DNFs for now rather than definitive DNFs. The first is They by K. Dick. I'll put a picture up because I listened to this on audio. It's a very short audio book. It's less than 3 hours long. But the reason I DNF'd it was because I just wasn't concentrating. And when I listen to audiobooks, I have to concentrate. I cannot be doing anything else. And I wasn't concentrating, so I wasn't following the story. This is a book which was published some time ago, but it was recently sort of rediscovered and republished in the last couple of years. There's an introduction by Carmen Maria Machado, which was really interesting. And it's sort of dystopic, sort of like low-key dystopic story. The kind of thing I normally really like, so I would like to revisit this at some point, potentially in a physical copy if I can find one. And then the other DNF was Brighton Rock by Greene. So this is a classic crime novel which I've been meaning to read for some time. I DNF'd it after maybe about 30 odd pages just because I wasn't getting into it and I kind of struggled to follow who was who, even though there isn't that many characters, but I struggle if there's more than 3 characters. So yeah, now is just not the time for me to read this. I may pick this up in future. If you've read this, if you think it is worth me revisiting, please do let me know. On to the books that I did make it to the end of. And there was only one book that I read which I wasn't that keen on. And that was Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. So I have read 2 Catriona Ward novels in the past, Sundial and The Last House on Needless Street, both of which I enjoyed. So I was highly anticipating this, and this was a disappointment for me. So the book opens with this young boy, I say young boy, he's sort of like a early teenager, who regularly goes on holiday with his family to this coastal town. And there's another young boy who regularly goes there as well with his family, and they meet and they're good friends. And there's also a girl there who they're friends with. So the 3 of them sort of hang out together by the sea. There's these, they tell each other this story about this sort of, it's a bit of an urban myth about this woman, sea creature person who sort of like haunts the coves. And there is some mystery elements in the background. There is someone who is called the Dagger Man, who takes pictures of sleeping children with a knife next to them, and then like sends the photo to the family or leaves the photo somewhere, so it doesn't sort of like physically harm the children, but it's taking pictures of them. So there's that sort of mystery element going on in the background as well. I would have DNF'd this within the first probably 40 to 50 pages if it wasn't for the fact that it is Catriona Ward, and I was, you know, anticipating it going somewhere interesting and there being some twists and turns, which there were. The blurb of the book actually tells you quite a lot of the story. It sort of goes up to at least sort of the halfway mark. So what we know from the blurb is that we have an author called Wilder who is writing the story, his childhood story of him and his friends and the Dagger Man. And then we know from the blurb that one of Wilder's friends, Skye, steals the story, sort of writes it himself, turns it into some lurid best-selling novel, and then Wilder wants to get his revenge on Skye. So there's quite a lot of and I mean there's even more in the blurb, and there's quite a lot of information in there which takes you sort of a fair way through the novel. So in some ways it's good, because if that wasn't there I probably would have DNF'd it, but obviously I knew it was going somewhere a bit more interesting. So we get sort of various different narrative voices, different forms of the story. It's not dissimilar in some way to a book I'll talk about in a bit, actually. And as we get each sort of perspective or different angle on things, we're starting to build up a picture of the truth and what really happened. There are twists and turns. I just was quite underwhelmed. I feel like this is the kind of thing that I do really like. Like if you told me the concept of this book, I'd be like, yes, I'm going to really like that. So it has like the bones of being a really good book for me, but for me, just the meat wasn't on there. There wasn't enough interesting substance that sort of kept me entertained as we were going through. And also one of the sort of twists or reveals, which I'm not going to say what that is, obviously, felt uncomfortable to me. I've not heard anyone else mention this though, so maybe it's just me, but it was something, there's a certain type of twist which, particularly when it's in a contemporary book, it just feels a bit icky to me. So anyway, that was a disappointment. The rest of these books, I enjoyed them all to varying degrees. So let's talk next about The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. So this is obviously a modern classic. It was first published in the early 80s and it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I read this as a buddy read with Gemma from Gem of Books and Jack from Spread Book Joy, and it was a good one to buddy read. So this is about Celie, who is a young black girl living in a terrible sort of family situation. She is being abused. The first line of the story is, "You better not never tell nobody but God, it'll kill your mammy." So she's been told not to tell anybody about what is happening to her. So the book is told in the form of her talking to God. So each chapter starts with "Dear God," and it's Celie talking to God, telling about her life and the sort of terrible things that are happening to her. The trauma really hits you in the face right from page one. So if you can sort of deal with those first few pages, then you'll be okay for the rest of the book, really. It's really in your face. And yeah, just awful. And so the letters that Celia is sort of writing to God are told in her voice, and the way it's written on the page is written as if sort of she were saying it, so her voice comes across very distinctly. As we get further into the story of Celie and her life, we do get another narrative perspective, which I won't say what that is because of spoilers, but that is I think interesting in how it sort of counterbalances Celie's narrative, and and is told in sort of a different way. Celie meets this entertainer, singer, I can't remember what's her name. Shug Avery, who sort of comes to town, and she's quite a bold character. So there's a lot about Celie and Shug's friendship, relationship. This is a queer book as well. I thought it was very, very good. I didn't like the ending, and not so much, I'm not going to say what that is, not so much the ending in itself, but rather the ending felt really rushed to me. I thought it was quite strange within the space of a few pages how we just had it all wrapped up. It didn't feel well plotted, but anyway, that aside, you know, I can see why it's a classic. I do want to acknowledge that I am aware of the fact that Alice Walker has said some controversial stuff in recent months, and also in previous years, which I hadn't been aware of, which I won't go into, but it did baffle me how the author who wrote this book is very feminist, it's very intelligently written, how that same person could then say what she has said, which is kind of stupid. So yeah, I found that a bit strange, but anyway, I read that one. Next, I read The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss. So this was a recommendation from Amelia Barlow Books, and Amelia recommended this specifically to me as a book that she thought I would enjoy, so thank you to Amelia. And I did really enjoy this. This is the fourth book I've read by Sarah Moss now, and I do think Sarah Moss is a really interesting author. This one is about a young girl. She's 15 years old, and she's at school one day. She has forgotten her phone. She's left it in the playing field, so she runs out to get her phone because class is about to start, and as she does so, she collapses. Her heart stops, she stops breathing, and she ends up in hospital for some time. The book is told from her father's perspective. So the family consists of the father, the mother, this 15-year-old girl, and her younger sister. And it's about how the family is coping with what's happened. She's in hospital for some time. They're doing tests on her. The doctors are trying to figure out what it might be. Could it be some sort of allergic reaction? Was there some sort of, what environmental circumstances was there that could have caused this to happen? Because she was a seemingly, healthy girl. The book is kind of a little bit funny in parts. I don't want to say it's a funny book because that would be misleading. But there is some humour underlying the story. So, for example, with the with the younger sister and her relationship with her older sister, the father, who we're hearing the story from, ruminates a lot on on mortality, and what's happened leads him to think a lot about how, you just go about your everyday life. You don't know, at any moment, you could get the phone call to say something's terrible's happened to someone. And sort of, how do you carry on knowing that could happen at any moment? And then he also has fears for his daughter who's in hospital, but also for his younger daughter as well. What if this is in some way hereditary? We also get these chapters about architecture and someone building a cathedral in the past. I didn't really get those bits. I am sure it was some deep metaphor. But yeah, I just didn't get those bits really. My only sort of quibble with the book is that the narrator, this father, is, the family's middle class. Oh, I should have said the mother is a doctor as well, which is interesting because he sort of accuses her of sort of medicalising everything, and as I guess you would, she comes to the situation not just from a mother's perspective, but from a doctor's perspective as well, with that sort of knowledge that she has as well, into the situation. But yeah, so the father, there's some stuff that he says or he thinks, which seem kind of a bit mean towards certain sections of society, shall we say. And I'm not entirely sure that it was meant to be that way, or how much of it was the author's views coming through, if you know what I mean. That's only like a slight thing, but it did make me kind of wince at parts. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good book. I really, really like Sarah Moss. So thank you to Amelia for recommending this one. Okay, 2 books left. And my second favourite book of the month was Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this recently won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, along with Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. It's the first time that the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction has been awarded to 2 books. I happened to already have this out from the library at the time the announcement was made. So this is a book that I have wanted to read since it was on the book and long list last year, but my local library didn't have a copy. Fortunately, my work library, where I've just started, did have a copy. And I really like this. I wasn't sure what I was going to think about it. I've heard quite mixed things. But I thought it was really, really good. So it's about this Wall Street tycoon and his wife, and it's set in the 20s in New York, when he's sort of like built up this sort of massive empire, and then obviously the market crashes, and it's the impact of that and the relationship between him and his wealth and what's happened to I guess the wider market. It's very much a commentary on, you know, capitalism. But what I particularly liked about this is the way that the story is told in sort of 4 different sections from 4 different perspectives and in 4 different forms. So in some ways, not dissimilar to Looking Glass Sound, but I thought this one did it really, really well. So the first section is a novelisation that we have, that someone has written about this Wall Street guy. What's his name? I don't know what his name is. Benjamin? So a novelisation that someone's written about his life. And then the second section is a draft of a memoir that this tycoon himself has written in response to the novelisation. So clearly not happy with how certain things were portrayed in the novelisation of his life, he then wants to write his own memoir. And then we have a third and a fourth section, which I won't say what they're about because that'll kind of be spoilers. But again, then we get different narrative voices, different perspectives, and as these layers build, we start to sort of see the true story coming through. I've heard some people say that one of the sections is particularly boring and you could even skip it. I think they're talking about the second section, which is this memoir. I didn't find it boring, actually, and I think that's largely because it's clearly not a finished memoir, it's a draft memoir. So what we have is the writer of the memoir has written sort of quite a lot of detail on certain aspects of his life, and then there are other points where he's just said add details about this, or, you know, add this. And what's really telling is what bits he is saying, what bits he really wants to expand on and put his own spin on, and what bits he is are sort of like afterthoughts, like, yeah, need to put in something about this. So I thought that was really interesting. I just had a really good time reading this book. As I say, I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it. It sounded, the concept of it really is what initially made me want to read it. And yeah, I thought it was great. And then the final book, so this is my most favourite book of the month, and it's Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. What is going on? She read a classic and she loved it. So I read this as part of Misery May, which was being hosted by Gemma from Gem of Books and Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. And Jude the Obscure was the read-along book. So this is my first time reading Thomas Hardy. I probably hadn't anticipated starting with Jude because of how miserable I have heard it to be. But this is where I started. And I really, really like this a lot. I'm not a big classic reader. I say that, but maybe that's because I've just not tried that many different classic authors. So I've sort of read various books by the Brontes, I've tried books by Dickens, I've tried books by Jane Austen. And I always expect classics to be too dense for me in terms of, I guess, the writing style and also the plot. And I always imagine there's going to be too many characters for me to keep track of. But I found this book to be very, very accessible, very, very readable, a really entertaining, if traumatic, story. So it's about Jude, and we follow Jude's life as a child who he dreams of going to university in Christminster, which I think is sort of like meant to be Oxford. Dreams of, going to study in Christminster. Jude is a very naive character. And there was a particular incident that I really liked sort of near the start where he is trying to get hold of these, I think it's Latin and Greek grammar books from someone, I forget who. And he thinks that once he's got hold of these books, that the book will teach him this key. So he imagines that in order to learn Latin, for example, he'll find out this key which will allow him to immediately be able to translate everything into Latin or vice versa, like as if there's some like code that means he will then just be able to change the words into the other language. I don't know. And that really speaks to Jude's naivety, but I just thought that was a really interesting and quite funny thought, that Jude imagined that could be the case. Jude has quite a traumatic life in many ways. In sort of, through poverty, through trying to meet his aspirations. He does meet a young woman called Arabella, and we sort of follow their relationship. I really, really like the character of Arabella in many ways. I thought she was a really great character. And yeah, so we sort of follow Jude as he goes through his life, through relationships, through different circumstances. There's a lot of commentary on and about religion and sort of societal expectations of people, of couples, of relationships, of marriage, and all those sorts of things. There is a particularly tragic event that happens further on in the book, which I won't say what that is. If you've read it, you will know what I mean. And I knew we were leading up to something. I knew there was going to be something like really, really terrible that was going to happen, something awful. And I really like the foreshadowing that goes on. And although I thought I had an idea about where it was going, I had no idea about how horrific this event was going to be. And I can't remember the last time I've had such a reaction to a book, because when we got to that bit, I basically just stared at that paragraph for about 2 or 3 minutes. I was going, oh my God, out loud. It's a good job I was at home when I was reading this bit, because I had been reading it in work at lunchtime earlier on in the day. And I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Oh, it was awful, but it was also really well done. I thought the pacing leading up to that section was excellent. So yeah, I think I'm a Thomas Hardy fan. Can I say that based on one book? This is a book that I will definitely reread. As I was reading it, there's just so much in here. And quite apart from anything else, it's just a really great story. It's a great story, great characters, really interesting characters, great writing, loads of themes going on in there, and I'm sure on a reread you'd sort of like be able to dig into stuff more, but it is a book I will reread in future, absolutely. It's probably one of my favourite classics now. I mean, that list is not very long. But I absolutely want to read more Thomas Hardy. So I think the next one I want to read is Desperate Remedies, which I probably hadn't heard of before hearing Scott talk about all of Thomas Hardy's novels. And I think Desperate Remedies, from what I understand, is quite sensationalist, maybe has some mystery elements to it. Sounds like my kind of thing, and my library has a copy. So I think that's going to be the next on my list. But yeah, so thank you to Gemma and to Scott for finally encouraging me to read some Hardy, because I loved it. So those are the books I read in May. So not a bad month all round. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know what the favourite book you read in May was. And do let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Thank you for watching. I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.